Chapter 7, Part 1 of 2 parts, and in this part we're going to go through contribution margin, break even, and targeted sales. Now, how do you predict financial future? Well, we're going to look at a number of methods, but in this particular part, we're going to look at contribution margin ratio, and break even analysis, and targeted profit. Now, these are the 3 things you need to do cost, volume, profit analysis. You need to have a sales price. You need to know the volume or predict a volume or what you think could happen in your business in the future. Remember, this is looking at the future, try to say what's going to happen. You need to be able to segregate your cost between variable and fixed, and then you'll get an idea of what your operating profit will be at various levels. Now, cost volume profit analysis is a great tool that helps managers make decisions, expresses relationship among cost volume and the company's profit, and determines sales volume needed to break even or earn a targeted profit. So this is a great tool if you're trying to figure out what do I need in the future to cover my costs if you're first starting off. Now remember, when you're doing this, you're making a lot of assumptions. You have to assume that the sales price remains constant throughout the relevant range. Now, the reason, again, with cost volume analysis, in order for this to work, remember, this is a means of estimating future profits based on expectations of volume and other costs. So, you have to assume that the sales price will remain constant. Managers can classify each cost either variable or fixed, which is not easy to do, and inventory levels will not change. The product mix offered for sale remains constant. Now let's take a look at that unit contribution margin. So contribution margin equals sales minus variable costs. Unit contribution margin equals selling price per unit minus variable cost per unit. All variable costs, product and period, must be included when calculating the unit contribution margin. Calculate the unit contribution margin and the contribution margin ratio. Now again, cost volume profit analysis relies on the interdependence of 5 components. Sales price per unit, knowing that, estimated volume, variable cost per unit, fixed costs, and operating income, because you're going to use those items in different calculations. So again, assumptions: no volume discounts, costs are linear throughout the relevant range, revenues are linear in the relevant range, inventory levels do not change, and sales mix will not change. Now the ratio is the percentage of each sales dollar that is available for covering fixed expenses and generating a profit. And this is your formula. It's the unit contribution margin divided by the sales price per unit equals the contribution margin, or it's the total contribution margin divided by the sales price, total sales. I'll give you the same number. So using the contribution margin to predict net income at different levels. So here is our example. We have a contribution margin income statement. So let's look at the contribution ratio. Now, since we don't have units, we're going to have to do dollars. So it's going to be our total contribution margin divided by our total sales. And that tells us we're going to have 76 cents of every dollar to cover our fixed expenses. Now in this example, I've done all 3. Remember, sales is always 100% because a lot of times you can use those percentages and predict what's going to happen to the bottom line. Now, if the relevant range is 200 to 640,000, we're going to do a contribution margin statement at between 200 for 200 and 420. Now, since they're within the relevant range, we know that our contribution margin ratios are relevant. So we're going to do our sales, we're going to less our variable, and we're going to use our percentage for variable cost, which is going to be our sales divided by our variable cost, and that gives us our contribution margin at each one of those levels. Then we have our operating income, and what this tells us is that 200,000 is too low. We will lose money if we only make that dollar volume in sales. Now let's look at CVP analysis to find break-even point and targeted profits. Break-even point is when sales level at which operating income is zero, fixed expenses equal the total contribution margin, and total sales equal total expenses. Sales below break-even point, you have a loss. Sales above break-even point, you have a profit. And if sales again equals break-even point, it's zero. So what does it look like in break-even units? We're going to take our fixed expenses plus our targeted net income, in this case it's always zero, divided by the contribution margin per unit. If we want break-even in dollars, we're going to take our fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin ratio. We have to assume we're doing break-even, that net income is zero. So we're doing the same problem. We know this is the formula. So break-even in sales is going to be 225,000 because we took our fixed cost divided by our contribution margin ratio of 76%. Now let's check. Our sales is 225 minus our variable cost at 24% minus our fixed cost gives us zero. So we know that is correct. Now let's look at another problem. Now, Mike had sales of 6.2 million and total expenses were 2.5, and of that amount, 1,612,000 were variable. So, operating income, there's your contribution margin, less our fixed costs, which gives us operating income of 3.7 million. What is our contribution margin ratio? In this case, it is 74%. Because we took our contribution margin and divided it by sales. What is break-even point in sales? It's going to be the 888, the fixed cost plus zero because we want to break even, divided by our contribution margin ratio, which tells us we need sales of $1.2 million if we want to break even. Now let's perform some sensitivity analysis. Again, remember, managers need to be prepared for increasing costs. They need to kind of have an idea of what's going to happen. And that helps you conduct what if. What if sales prices change? What if costs change? What if the sales mix change? This is what cost volume profit analysis is very good at, is to help you to see how your bottom line is going to react to changes, future possible changes. And you can do alternatives. Example is, do an example where everything turns out correctly, and then do an example where everything's wrong, and then do something in the middle. So remember, changing the sales price and volume. The break-even point changes, the unit contribution margin changes. Now, if the sales price goes down, then the unit contribution margin goes down, then the volume needed to break even or achieve a targeted profit goes up. If the sales price goes up, then the unit contribution margin goes up, then the volume needed to break even or achieve target profit goes down. Now, changing variable costs. Break-even point changes, unit contribution margin changes. Higher variable costs have the same effect as lower selling prices, reduces unit contribution margin. So, if the variable costs go up, the unit contribution margin goes down, the volume needed to break even or achieve a target goes up. If the variable costs go down, then the unit contribution margin goes up, then the break-even needed to break even or achieve a profit goes down. Now, what about fixed costs? Changes break-even point does not change unit contribution margin. If fixed costs go up, then the volume needed to break even or achieve a target of profit goes up. If the fixed costs go down, then the volume needed to break even or achieve a targeted profit goes down. That concludes our part 1 for chapter 7.